The UFC pay-per-view is what most of us filthy casuals tune into, and if you are the filthiest of casual, it would be the UFC pay-per-view main event. The main events of a UFC pay-per-view can be a hit and miss, but normally for every pay-per-view, it is what we are tuning in to see, hoping for an amazing end to the night of fights. The UFC pay-per-views sometimes end with some monumental shock value and give us fans an end to the night of fights we all hope of. So let's take a look at some of these iconic and legendary moments. This is the Fight franchise and the top 10 shocking pay-per-view ends in UFC history. Number 10, UFC 199. The last pay-per-view before a new era of the 200s was ushered into the UFC, UFC 199 was originally supposed to be the rematch of Luke Rockhold and Chris Weidman, after Rockhold smashed Weidman for the title at UFC 194. This rematch, however, wouldn't take place, as Weidman had to pull out due to an injury. This led to the UFC scrambling for a short notice replacement, which ended up being Michael Bisping. Rockhold had beaten Bisping before, and also with Bisping on short notice, no one really gave him a chance to win. Bisping would be brash and heated in the build-up of the fight, talking trash to Rockhold. Come fight night, Bisping did the unthinkable. He would KO Rockhold in the first round to realise his dream and become the first ever UFC champion from England. Bisping would not be gracious in defeat, talking trash after the fight in his post-fight speech and even in the press conference after. This was an unreal shocker and brilliant end to the pay-per-view, which definitely had UK fans buzzing and up all night after the pay-per-view ended. Number 9. UFC 257. During the pandemic, the UFC managed to keep the show rolling and give us fight nights and major pay-per-views, including the famous UFC 251 and Fight Island, which was a huge success. But overall, this time for the UFC was devoid of star power and shock factor, due to having no crowds and the fights taking place behind closed doors. One event took place with a small crowd. That was UFC 257, with Conor McGregor returning after a year out of the cage, after his brilliant win after beating Donald Cerrone. He would return and face former foe Dustin Poirier, where a shaven-headed McGregor was much more cordial. McGregor was at the time eyeing up a potential bout versus Manny Pacquiao. This led to a bout where McGregor came out with a heavy boxing stance and was having his legs smashed with heavy leg kicks from Poirier. This led McGregor to be compromised, where he began losing the battle on the feet, which led to a crazy shocker where Conor McGregor would be KO'd for the first time in the octagon. Yes, we had seen McGregor lose before, but never KO'd, and this became global news and took all the headlines on social media, which was unbelievable. To this day, seeing McGregor curled up on the floor after being KO'd is surreal and easily one of the most shocking ends to a UFC pay-per-view ever. Number 8. UFC 264. The follow-up from the last entry after Conor McGregor's loss to Dustin Poirier, the rivalry became heated around disputed money not being donated to charity and choice words between both guys. This led to a trilogy bout which was very heated going into the fight, where Conor McGregor came back trying to recreate his old trash-talking days against a calm and relaxed Dustin Poirier. This led to a fight between the two parties where they picked up from the last fight, where both men fought on the feet and then on the ground across the first round. Towards the end of the first round, Conor would miss a punch and step back and fall on the ground, and the round ended. Conor McGregor immediately gestured to the ref that his leg had snapped and that he could no longer continue, which had an anticlimactic but shocking end to the fight. Seeing Conor McGregor on the floor injured, unable to continue, was a sight to behold. What made it much more crazy was his post-fight speech on the floor with Joe Rogan, where even with a broken leg, Conor was still on smoke. This is an iconic and definitely shocking end to a UFC pay-per-view. Number 7. UFC 71. During the come-up of the UFC and MMA, the sport was personified by one individual, and that was Chuck Liddell. With his incredible fight style and his unique look, Liddell would become quite the popular star in the 2000s due to his fame and popularity garnered at the time as champion in the UFC. Liddell went on a 7 KO win streak on his way to the title and some legendary and brilliant title defenses. Liddell would face a ghost from his past in the form of Quinton Rampage Jackson, who KO'd Liddell in Pride in 2003. Rampage joined the UFC and beat Marvin Eastman and a title shot versus Liddell. And even though Rampage beat Liddell before, this was a changed Liddell on the best run of his career. He was the UFC's global star at the time, and we all knew him as the best fighter in the world, who was on a streak beating everyone. That's why when Rampage KO'd Liddell to dethrone him and take his gold, it sent shockwaves around the sport. History had repeated itself, and the superstar which is Chuck Liddell was no more. This at the time was a real shocking end to the pay-per-view, as it saw legend and superstar of MMA come to an end. Number 6. UFC 194. If there is one fighter in MMA history who has given us countless shocking pay-per-view endings, whether good or bad, it's the notorious Conor McGregor. And this was no different than when he went up against the King of Rio, Jose Aldo. Conor and Jose had a heated back and forth, one the likes never had before or after in MMA. The UFC put on a world tour for the pair to promote the fight and make the fight a global spectacle, where Conor could push Jose's buttons in the build-up of the fight. But closer to the fight date, Jose pulled out due to an injury, which led Conor Conor to beating Chad Mendes for interim gold. This meant more time and energy to hype the fight up and for Conor to rile up and throw Aldo off his game. The fight took place in the main event of UFC 194, where Aldo and McGregor squared off and McGregor would create history, scoring the fastest finish in a title fight in UFC history, knocking out Aldo in 13 seconds. This caused shockwaves around the world and was a moment which had the nation of Ireland in pandemonium and the rest of the world in disbelief, seeing how real McGregor's hype truly was, which earns it a well-deserved spot on the list. Number 5. UFC 193. There have been quite a few superstars in the history of MMA, but of all of them, only one female stood head and shoulders above her peers in the superstardom realm, and that was Ronda Rousey. Ronda would storm through the competition in MMA, and once she got in the UFC, her star grew to unbelievable heights, where she became a household name. This all led to a bout where undefeated superstar Ronda Rousey was taking on undefeated contender Holly Holm. The entire MMA fan base and world believed in Ronda's hype, and no one could blame them. She had won every fight with relative ease and finished every opponent. This is why we were all in for a shock when Holm was schooling Rousey on the feet and was giving the rowdy one a run for her money. This all led up to one of the greatest moments in MMA history, where Holm head kicked Rousey and left her defeated in the middle of the octagon. The 50,000 plus in Melbourne, Australia was stunned, and all of the millions watching at home. This was an unreal end to the pay-per-view, which left fans on a high for hours after the pay-per-view ended. Number 4. UFC 162. There have been many great fighters in MMA, and quite a few are considered in the GOAT conversation. One of the names always mentioned is the legendary and iconic Anderson Silva. Silva was a unique one-of-one fighter who even future legends have imitated and built their skills off, but Silva, after his stints around the world, would join the UFC and put together a run which, as of recording this list, has still yet to be beat. Silva went on an impressive 16-0 win streak, which included some monumental and legendary wins along the way. This led to a showdown where Silva was taking on his next contender, an up-and-coming and undefeated Chris Weidman, who was expected to be a lamb to slaughter, which is why it was unbelievable when Chris Weidman would put the taunting and cocky Anderson Silva in his place, KOing him in the second round and leaving the entire world in disbelief. Nobody saw this coming. For the pay-per-view to give us a new champion is something us fans are getting used to, but at the expense of one of the best MMA fighters of all time, who had the best win streak in UFC history, this is easily one of the most shocking and wild ends to a pay-per-view in MMA history. Number 3. UFC 196. After his legendary win versus Jose Aldo, Conor McGregor was a superstar and a household name who had lived up to his hype. This would inspire Conor McGregor to recreate history that he achieved in Cage Warriors. Conor went up a weight division to challenge Rafael dos Anjos for undisputed lightweight gold in order to become a simultaneous two-division world champion. This dream of Conor's would have to wait, as RDA pulled out due to an injury, so the UFC, eager to keep their cash cow on the card, rang up some short-notice replacements, but the call to fight was answered by none other than Nate Diaz. Diaz would take the fight with 11 days notice, taking Conor on at welterweight. Conor, after his win versus Aldo, seemed invincible and had so much hype going into the fight, and many people dismissed Diaz as a threat just due to the hype surrounding Conor. This led to an unbelievable 2-round war which saw Diaz weather the early McGregor storm, which saw a tired McGregor shoot for a takedown and end up being submitted to give him his first loss in the UFC. This was an amazing moment which caused shockwaves in and out of the sport due to the magnitude of the fight, which made Diaz a star, a truly shocking way to end what was UFC 196. Number 2. UFC 278. In terms of shocking pay-per-view endings, this damn well could easily be number 1, along with many other great moments on this list. At UFC 278, the UFC travelled to Salt Lake City, where Kamaru Usman, who at the time was the pound-for-pound best fighter in the world, was chasing to tie Anderson Silva's legendary record of 16 straight wins in the UFC, while Leon Edwards was looking to spoil the party. This fight was a rematch of years prior, where both men squared off in 2015. UFC 278 led to a showdown of an interesting matchup, where Leon started the fight strong, where he became the first fighter to take down Usman and won the first round. Following on from here, it went back to normal. Usman took over the fight and began grinding down Edwards and started finding a path to victory, to what seemed a decision. This led to a 5th round where Usman did more of the same, as it seemed like he was going to retain his title and stay pound for pound number 1 and tie Anderson Silva's record. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, Edwards KO'd Usman with one of the best head kicks of all time, flatlining Usman and becoming champion in one of the best come-from-behind wins ever. This was a surreal end to the pay-per-view and ended what was becoming quite a mundane fight on a monumental high. Genuinely, you can give it a strong case for number 1, as it was so unbelievably shocking. But number 1 might just be the most legendary end to a pay-per-view in MMA history. Number 1. UFC 229. Some of you may have guessed this was going to be number 1, and the result of the fight may have not been shocking, but what took place after damn sure was. At UFC 229 we saw the return of Conor McGregor. After his super mega fight with Floyd Mayweather, he would return and take on Khabib Nurmagomedov for undisputed lightweight gold, which had arguably the most heated build-up in UFC history. This led to a fight where Khabib would smash Conor and end up winning by submission in the 4th round. Many thought the always respectful Khabib would be gracious in victory. This was not the case. Enraged after submitting his rival, he would jump the cage and attack Conor's team, where an all-out melee occurred, which caused all sorts of people to get involved in the assault, which led to the UFC president Dana White having to help de-escalate the situation. This was drama and box office and worth every penny of the pay-per-view. It kept most of the fans glued to social media for hours after the pay-per-view had finished, looking for updates on what happened, and everyone went after the pay-per-view to watch the post-fight press conference. To this day, we haven't had anything more shocking to end a UFC pay-per-view. This felt like a WWE end to a UFC pay-per-view. It was truly unbelievable, and is easily the most shocking end a UFC pay-per-view has ever had. Did you enjoy the video? Let us know down in the comments below. What do you think is the most shocking end to a UFC pay-per-view in history? Put that down in the comments below. And leave it in the comments which pay-per-views I missed out. Leave a like if you've enjoyed the video and subscribe for more MMA and fight content coming soon. We hope you enjoyed the video and we'll catch you in the next one.